In November 2012, a woman named Cari Farver drove to a man's apartment in Omaha, Nebraska. She was 37 years old. She had a son at home, a job she was good at, a life she was building forward, not backward. She left that apartment on the evening of November 13th, and nobody who loved her ever saw her again. That alone would be enough to tell this story. But that's not what makes this case like almost nothing else in the history of American criminal investigation. Because in the days after Cari Farver vanished, she didn't go quiet. Over the next 4 years, from a dead woman's phone, someone sent thousands of messages. Threatening messages, loving messages, furious ones, desperate ones. Messages that said, "I'm watching you." Messages that said, "She needs to stay away from you." Messages that said, "I'm still out there." The question that would consume investigators, family, and eventually a jury was not simply what happened to Cari Farver. It was, who was she after she was gone? And the answer would take years to find.
To understand what happened to Cari Farver, you first have to understand who she was. She grew up in western Iowa, Macedonia, the kind of small town where everyone knows your name, and where that can feel like both comfort and weight. She was analytically minded. She built a career in information technology at a time when that still felt uncommon for women in the Midwest. She was good at it, precise, reliable, the kind of person who solved problems methodically and didn't leave things unfinished. That last detail would matter later. And she was a mother. Maxwell was the center of her life. By 2012, Cari was raising him largely on her own. She had built something stable around him, a home, a routine, a future that moved forward in small, intentional steps. Her mother, Nancy Rainey, was her closest confidant, the kind of relationship where nothing important went unsaid for long. Which is why, when things began to unravel, Nancy was the first person to know something was wrong, and the last person anyone listened to.
In the autumn of 2012, Cari began a new relationship. His name was Dave Krupa, a mechanic living in the Omaha area. They'd met online, unremarkable by then. They started seeing each other casually in November. What Cari may or may not have fully known was that Krupa was also seeing someone else, a woman named Liz Kolyar. Krupa, by his own account, wasn't looking for something exclusive. He was seeing both women. That was his position. Whether both women experienced that the same way is something the evidence can't fully answer. What the evidence can answer is what happened next. But to understand that, you first have to understand the night everything stopped. On the evening of November 13th, 2012, Cari Farver drove to Dave Krupa's apartment. She was seen there that evening. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was preparing to disappear. No goodbye messages, no withdrawal from Maxwell. No indication that this was anything other than an ordinary visit. At some point that night, she left. Her car was found shortly afterward, near the apartment complex. Still there, unlocked, abandoned. She hadn't arranged another ride. She hadn't told anyone she was going somewhere else. She had simply stepped away from her vehicle and out of her own life. Or so it appeared. At first, nobody thought to question that, because within days of Cari's disappearance, something happened that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Something that, at the time, seemed to answer every question. Messages began arriving. From Cari. Dave Krupa received the first ones. They were strange, erratic, angry in ways that didn't match the woman he'd been seeing. But they came from her number, her accounts, her name. Then Liz Golyar began receiving them too, also from Cari. Threatening messages. Messages warning her to stay away from Dave. Messages that carried a heat and obsession that felt, to those receiving them, like something had broken inside a woman who had previously seemed entirely stable. And for investigators, that created a problem. Not the kind of problem that raises alarm. The kind that makes a case seem solved before it started. Cari's employer reported she hadn't returned to work. Maxwell waited at home. Nancy Rainey started making phone calls no one could answer. And the messages kept coming. Weeks turned into months. Months accumulated. And slowly, without anyone consciously deciding it, a narrative hardened into something dangerous. Cari Farver wasn't missing. She had chosen to disappear.
It was a reasonable conclusion, given what everyone could see. It was also completely wrong. But at the time, there was only one person saying so: her mother. Nancy Rainey knew her daughter, not as a case file, not as a message thread, but as a person. Her voice, her rhythms, the specific way she expressed herself when she was angry or afraid or happy. And the person writing these messages wasn't Cari. The tone was wrong. The phrasing was wrong. The emotional pattern was wrong. Nancy began calling authorities. She pushed back against the assumption that Cari had left voluntarily. She said, repeatedly, that her daughter would never have walked away from Maxwell. Not for any reason, not for any man. But the evidence everyone could see told a different story. Messages were still arriving. Accounts were still active. A digital life was still moving, still speaking, still reacting, still furious. So investigators faced a contradiction that had no easy resolution. A woman who was gone, but still somehow present. What nobody realized yet was that those two things weren't a contradiction at all. They were the crime.
Meanwhile, Liz Golyar had positioned herself carefully inside this situation, not as a suspect, as a victim. She went to police. She showed them the threatening messages she was receiving. Messages she said were from Cari Farver, who had apparently fixated on both her and Dave. She appeared distressed. She cooperated. She provided information willingly. And at the time, without any reason yet to doubt her, that's exactly what she looked like. A woman caught in the crossfire of someone else's obsession. That performance would hold for years. Because Liz Golyar was patient in a way that was, in retrospect, extraordinary. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't overcorrect or collapse under pressure. She maintained a coherent story across dozens of police interactions, across years of scrutiny, while simultaneously sustaining, from her own devices, a campaign of thousands of messages designed to make a dead woman seem alive and dangerous. Think about what that requires. Not just the technical execution, the psychological discipline,
of presenting yourself as a victim, calmly, consistently, convincingly, while knowing what you know. In August 2013, she made a decision that investigators would later look back on as the first crack in the foundation. Liz Galyar's home caught fire. She reported it as a terrifying accident. Her pets had died, she said. She had barely escaped. The kind of event that generates immediate sympathy, the instinct to comfort, to believe, to help. Investigators later concluded the fire had been staged. Not as a crime in isolation, but as a window into someone who didn't just react to situations, someone who constructed them, who understood, with apparent instinct, that the best way to avoid suspicion is to ensure you always appear to be the one being wronged. That detail, at the time, barely registered. It would matter later. By 2015, the case had been open for 3 years. 3 years of messages. 3 years of a missing woman's accounts still active. 3 years of investigators working from the assumption that Cari Farver had chosen to vanish. And then something shifted. Not a dramatic break, not a confession or a witness, something quieter. Investigators began looking at the digital trail differently. Not just what the messages said, but where exactly they came from. IP addresses, device identifiers, location data embedded in metadata. The digital fingerprint that every device leaves behind invisibly every time it connects to the internet. Individually, these data points meant little. But investigators weren't looking at individual messages anymore. They were looking at thousands of them. And when you map thousands of data points across years, a pattern emerges that you can't argue away. When investigators traced the origin of the messages attributed to Cari Farver, what they found didn't match the story they had been building for 3 years. The messages weren't coming from a missing woman who had abandoned her life. They were coming from a specific set of devices. Devices connected to a specific person. The same person who had been sitting across from investigators for years, reporting harassment, appearing distressed, cooperating. Liz Galyar. Stop and consider what that means. For 3 years, investigators had been working a case in which the primary victim was secretly the perpetrator, and the perpetrator was playing the victim. The woman who had filed the stalking reports was sending the messages. The woman who had appeared, session after session, as a cooperative witness, was the reason there was no Cari Farver to find. At this moment, the case didn't simply change direction. The entire architecture of what investigators thought they understood collapsed. They weren't dealing with a missing person who had become a stalker. They were dealing with something far more calculated. A manufactured reality. Built message by message, account by account, year by year, to make sure no one ever looked in the right place. As the investigation refocused, 2 specific pieces of evidence proved pivotal, and both of them came from mistakes. The first was a photograph. During the years of impersonation, Galyar had sent an image, the precise purpose less important now than what it accidentally contained. The image showed a partial view of a foot. Forensic analysis determined the foot did not belong to Cari Farver. It belonged to Liz Golyer. An unforced error. The kind that only happens when someone has made thousands of decisions under sustained pressure across years. Eventually, the accumulation produces something that doesn't match, a detail that can't be explained, a slip too small to anticipate and too specific to deny. But that wasn't the most significant discovery. When investigators examined the deleted files on Liz Golyer's phone, they found photographs. Photographs that appeared to depict human remains. A no-body murder case is among the most difficult to prosecute. Without physical remains, without a confirmed cause of death, the prosecution must build its argument from the digital trail, the behavioral record, and the sheer accumulated weight of everything the evidence implies. In this case, the photographs on Golyer's phone moved the case from the realm of inference into something more direct. The investigation, for the first time in 4 years, had somewhere solid to stand.
In January 2017, more than 4 years after Cari Farver's car was found abandoned near Dave Krupa's apartment, Liz Golyer was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. 4 years. In that time, Maxwell had grown up carrying a version of his mother's story that wasn't true. A story that said she had chosen to leave him, that she had become someone dangerous and unrecognizable. He had been asked, without anyone using those words, to hold a portrait of his mother that bore no resemblance to who she was. The trial proceeded later that year. Prosecutors laid out the digital architecture, methodically, in the language of IP addresses and device fingerprints and account access logs. Expert witnesses walked the jury through what had been built. A multi-account, multi-platform impersonation of a dead woman, sustained with a patience and deliberateness that was difficult to fully comprehend. Dave Krupa testified about the relationships, about the messages, about the years he had spent believing he was being stalked by a woman he had once cared about. The prosecution's argument was not complex, even if the evidence was. Liz Golyer killed Cari Farver in November 2012. Then she spent years making sure no one looked for the body. The defense challenged the forensic conclusions, pointed to the absence of confirmed physical remains, questioned whether certainty was possible without a confirmed cause of death. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. Liz Golyer was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There are things about this case that remain unresolved. Cari Farver's remains have never been recovered in any complete form. There is no grave, no confirmed location, no place her family can return to. And beyond that absence, there is another kind of loss that doesn't get discussed as often. For years, the story of Cari Farver that circulated, the story law enforcement was working from, that the people around her had implicitly absorbed, was the story Liz Golyer had written. A story about a disturbed woman who had walked away from her child, who had become a stalker, who had chosen to vanish rather than be responsible. That story was a lie. Every word of it. Cari Farver woke up every morning and went to a job she was good at. She raised a son she loved. She called her mother. She drove to a man's apartment on a November evening in 2012, and she should have come home. she didn't. And no conviction, however just, however hard-won, gives back what was taken. Not to Maxwell, not to Nancy Rainey, not to anyone who loved her. Nancy Rainey never stopped asking the question, even when the official narrative had quietly moved on, even when the messages kept arriving and the world around her seemed to accept that Cari had simply become someone else, even when asking felt like pushing against a wall that didn't move. She was right. From the beginning. She knew her daughter, and she never let anyone forget it. Cari Farver was 37 years old when she was murdered in November 2012. Her killer was convicted of first-degree murder in 2017. Cari's remains have never been fully recovered. She is remembered by her son, Maxwell, and her mother, Nancy.